Here's your guaranteed success midterm exam review outline. First thing you have to know is all the vocabulary, not because I test you so much on the vocabulary per se, but because there are sentences that you have to translate. The sentences are taken from previous quizzes or from the text, so if you've done the work before and learned from the mistakes that you made on previous quizzes, this should be very easy. Related to the vocabulary is all the principal parts of the verb. There are 4 principal parts for every normal verb. There are a few defective verbs out there that you'll learn about much later. But there are 4 principal parts, and remember that the 4th principal part has 3 genders because it's actually an adjective. The only one that I've abbreviated is the 4th principal part, laudatus, laudata, and laudatum. The root is the L-A-U-D-A-T-U-S. Remember that your book is going to abbreviate it so that it's going to look like this, laudo, and then it'll just have A-R-E, and then it'll just have V-I, and then it'll just have one of the 3 gendered answers right here, laudatus, laudata, laudatum. But for future reference for this class, remember that there are 4 principal parts, and the 4th principal part is a participle, which is a kind of adjective, so it has a masculine, a feminine, and a neuter form. You have to be able to generate principal parts for verbs that you haven't seen at this point, as I've shown you in earlier screencasts. And if you've been memorizing them, or if you start to memorize them, you'll realize that it's very easy to predict principal parts once you start to learn their patterns. That relates to point number 3. You have to have the ability to identify the conjugation of a verb. The example I gave up here, laudo, is a first conjugation because it has, in the 2nd principal part, it ends in A-R-E. A second conjugation verb in the 2nd principal part would end with a long E-R-E. That's really as far as you've gotten in this class so far, but just for the sake of understanding what's coming up, a 3rd conjugation verb would end with a short E-R-E in the 2nd principal part. The 2nd principal part is really the key to this class so far as what you know for verbs. So if it ends with an A-R-E, it's a first conjugation. That's tested specifically on the quiz. If it ends with a long E-R-E, it's a 2nd conjugation verb. At this point, you don't have any third eye, or 4th conjugations, but they will come up later in the class. Be aware of that. There's also a 3rd eye and a 4th conjugation, but you haven't learned them at this point. Topic 4 is the ability to identify the declension of a noun. It's a similar process. If you have a lexical entry, for example, regii, as the book abbreviates it, which is the nominative singular if you write it out in full, and the genitive singular if you write it out in full. If you have this lexical entry, because the genitive ends in AE, that's the best and safest way to identify it, that's a first declension. If, however, you have a word that ends in an I in the genitive, you know that you have a 2nd declension. Written out in full, it would look like this, dominus, domini. That's a 2nd declension. However, it's not the only kind of 2nd declension. The 2nd declension has a number of subcategories. So it's important that you understand that there are a number of subcategories for the 2nd declension, but all of them are going to have I in the genitive. If you identify the first declension by AE in the genitive, and if you identify the 2nd declension by an I in the genitive, you'll always get it right. So don't look at the first thing in the dictionary. That's not as useful as the 2nd thing in the dictionary. Let me illustrate. The first kind of 2nd declension looks like dominus, domini. Another subcategory looks like puer, pueri. Another one looks like liber, libri. And you'll note that what's different between puer, pueri, and liber, libri is that puer keeps the E, whereas liber in the genitive loses the E. But note that they all have an I in the genitive form. And then finally, you have templum, templi, which again has an I in the genitive form. So that's how you identify the declension of a noun, by the genitive ending. Second declension has a lot more variety than the first declension, but it's no more difficult to identify it. Don't ever look at the nominative. It doesn't tell you the information that you need to know. It's all about the genitive. The templum templi, by the way, is the model for the neuter. The remainder of the second declensions are mostly masculine. There are some feminines in there. The fifth point is that you have to understand the conjugation of the indicative present active. I've done this many times, so I won't belabor the point. You take the second principal part. I mentioned before that that's the most important principal part so far in the class. You drop for the first and second conjugation the RE. I'll write it out twice because that way you remember that it's for the first and second conjugation. This is the pattern. It'll change in the third, third I, and fourth conjugations, which you haven't learned yet. And that's why I'm writing it out twice. After you drop the RE, you add the primary active personal suffixes, which are O, S, T, mus, tis, and NT. These represent the personal pronouns I, you singular, he, she, and it, we, you plural, or you all, and they. I is the first person singular. This is the second person singular. This is the third singular. This is the first plural, second plural, and third plural. So the singular is the first three. The plural is the second three. Once you have a word like laudare, the second principal part, because it ends in RE, you drop the RE, then you add the ending, OST, mus, tis, and NT. Note, however, when A and O, or in general in Latin, it's very often the case that when two vowels come together, the first one, not always, but the first one tends to fall off. That doesn't happen all the way through, just for the A and the O together. Two vowels coming together tend to cancel one of them out. The rest of the time, you keep the A, because the rest of the time, the A is followed by a consonant. A-S, A-T, A-mus, A-tis, A-ent. When the A is followed by a vowel in the first person singular, the A drops off. That does not happen for the second conjugation. Look at the model for the second conjugation. I could use monera with a long E in the second principal part. You drop off the RE, and then you add those same exact endings, OST, mus, tis, and NT. In this case, there is no irregularity. The E and the O stay, the E and the S, the E and the T, the E and the mus, the E and the tis, the E and the ent. I, worn, you, worn, etc. is how you translate the indicative present active. The conjugation of the imperative present active follows a similar process. You take the second principal part, laudare or monera. You drop the RE, just like last time. And then you either add nothing to get the second person singular, or to this theme, you add TE to get the second person plural. Sorry, I almost wrote the same one twice. this is the second person plural. So take the second principal part, drop the RE, add nothing, or add TE. Because the imperative present active can only be translated for you or you plural, you all. And that's a command. So lauda would translate as praise. Hey you, praise her. Silly examples, but it helps a little bit to put it in context, I hope. And laudata or moneta would say, hey, you guys, praise as a command. Or warn. You all better warn them. Warn them now. That's my dramatic illustration of what a command sounds like. Point number 7 is the conjugation of the indicative imperfect active. So verbs are identified by mood, tense, and voice. Mood is indicative, that's for assertions about reality. Imperfect is past tense that is ongoing or progressive, and active is the voice, meaning that the subject does the action rather than the passive voice in which the subject receives the action. Same process for the indicative imperfect active as the present and the imperative present active. You take the second principal part, drop the RE from the first and second conjugation style verbs, and then you add the sign of the imperfect, which is BA. That's an infix that comes in between the theme and the suffixes at the end. And then you add the personal suffixes, which in this case are M, S, T, mus, tis, and NT. Note that this is not O this time, but M. So when you see it in action, you take laudare, you drop the RE, you add the sign of the imperfect, which is BA, and then you add the M. And you just do the same process all the way through for a first or a second conjugation verb. There are no irregularities, no unusual surprises, and the translation of the imperfect is an ongoing action in the past. This usually gives students a little bit of difficulty trying to figure out what that means. But if you'd look at a word in the imperfect, Monet bomb, let's say, that would be I used to warn, or the alternative, I was warning. Whichever one sounds more natural to you in the context is what you should use. I used to warn her every day is an appropriate translation for that. Or I was warning her every day. Whichever one in the sentence that you're translating sounds better, that's the one you should use. A simple point is that the nouns and adjectives agree in case, number, and gender. Case, number, and gender. Adjectives and nouns have to have the same case, number, and gender. An example would be nominative, singular, feminine. That's an easy concept to understand that they have to agree. You just have to remember that they don't always have to have the same exact endings. They will often have the same exact endings, like dominus is a nominative, singular, masculine. And so an adjective to agree with it in case, number, and gender would also have to be nominative, singular, and masculine. However, there are some tricky first declension nouns that look as if they would be feminine because most first declension nouns are feminine. They end in A and they look feminine. But they're actually masculine. And so these two do not have the same ending, even though they do agree in case, number, and gender. Sometimes they will have the same ending. Sometimes they won't have the same ending, but they always have to agree in case, number, and gender. So there's some tricky ones on the exam meant to emphasize this point. Go back and review the book for the list of the nouns that are in the first declension and that are actually masculine. It's poeta, nauta, agricola, and the last one is pirata. Pirate, poet, sailor, and farmer. Look feminine because they're in the first declension, but they're actually masculine. So that can be tricky for matching the adjectives because they will not end with the same suffixes. You've learned the irregular verb to be in the indicative present active. Say it out loud with me, even though I can't hear you. Sum es est, sumus estis, sunt. Practice that forward and backwards. Sunt estis sumus, est es sum. I am, you are, he, she, or it is. We are, you all are, they are. That's the indicative present active. You've also learned the indicative imperfect active. Note that these do not follow the same pattern as the earlier indicative present active. They do not follow the same as the indicative imperfect active because they are irregular and they must simply be memorized. Eram, eras, erat. Eramus, eratus, erant. Eram is I was, or I used to be. You were, or you used to be. He, she, or it was, or used to be. We were, or we used to be. You all were, you all used to be. And they were, they used to be. I tend to just put on the test, they were, you all were, we were, rather than used to be. Eram, eras, erat, eramus, eratus, erant, erant, eratus, eramus, erat, eras, eram. You've got to say them out loud. You've got to make flashcards for these. They're going to be used continuously, and they are irregular. Memorize them immediately. You have to know the declension of all first and second declension nouns. The process I can outline to you. If you have a word like amica, amicae, that's a first declension, or a second declension like dominus, domini, or any of the other second declension varieties. The process is to take the second thing in the dictionary, which would be the genitive ending, written out in full, not just the abbreviated ending. You would start with that. You would drop the I, the AE, for the first declension, or the I for the second declension, sorry. Now you have your starting point. You take the genitive entry and you drop the AE or the I. Again, you start with the second thing in the dictionary because it's more consistent and it will apply throughout the class when we get into the third declension, the fourth declension, and the fifth declension. That will be your only way to do it. It won't be possible to do it with the nominative and get the right answer. So now that you have your starting point, after you've dropped the genitive I, you add your endings. A, AE, AE, AM, long A, then the plural. AE, aurum, is, as, and is. For the second declension, it goes us, I, O, long O. This is also a long O too, it doesn't really matter. I don't emphasize the long marks, nor will real Latin text or ancient inscriptions or manuscripts. And then aurum, is, os, and is. My writing got a little smaller at the bottom there, but this has been covered countless times in this screencast already, and probably a pretty easy process if you've been reading the book and doing the exercises. This is the process for every kind of second declension, every kind of first declension, and there's only one type of first declension anyway. You add these endings. The first one is the nominative singular, then the genitive singular, the dative singular, the accusative singular, and then the ablative singular. Then the same pattern in the plural, the nominative plural, the genitive plural, the dative plural, the accusative, and the ablative plural. You have to know what each of those case endings does. The nominative, for example, is for the subject. That's the doer of the action. The genitive so far expresses possession. I prefer that you translate the genitive as of, as in, this is the book of the boy, rather than apostrophe s, because it's just more consistent when we learn further uses of the the genitive later. The dative is used so far for the indirect object of the verb. Now that's a difficult term to understand probably unless you understand that you translate it usually using to or for. Note that the next point down here is going to be the dative of possession, so you can also use the dative like the genitive for possession, but only in certain circumstances with the verb to be. It has to be a form of the verb to be. Sum, eram, past or present tense, sum es est, sumus estis sunt, etc. Eram, eras, erat, eramus, eratus, erat, etc. So the dative can sometimes be used for possession, as long as you use the verb to be in the sentence. After the dative, you have the accusative, which is for the direct object of the verb. That's the thing that receives the action. For example, in the sentence, I hit the ball receives the action. I see the man receives the action. That's called the indirect object. In the dative, it would be, you could give the example, I give flowers to the girl. I give flowers, that's the direct object, flowers. I give flowers to the girl, but the word to is in the indirect object. And finally, the ablative is often found after a preposition. So it's the object of a preposition, but sometimes there's no preposition. In the cases where there's no preposition, I've given you the list of words to try to see which one sounds best. By, from, with, in, at, or on all work pretty well with an ablative when there is not a specific preposition specified. The dative of possession, as was mentioned, is the dative when you use the verb to be. You can have a sentence like sapientia est tibi. That's the dative. And that sentence, even though it looks like it might say wisdom is to you, it should be translated more like you have wisdom. The dative is non-literally translated as a possessive. There is wisdom for you, or you have wisdom. Wisdom belongs to you. It's an awkward thing in English to do, but you have to understand the dative of possession because it is a not uncommon form in Latin. Finally, you have to be able to translate sentences. That's what you've been doing all along, so there'll be various sentences for you to practice with. You can take the exam twice for the combination, or the average rather, of the two scores. So remember that, 2 times for the average, not for the better of the 2 scores. So you can't just get a 0 the first time and get 100% the second time, because then you'll get an F. The benefit of taking that exam that way is I give you the correct answers when you take the exam, and you can actually learn from it on the spot. You don't have to wait 2 weeks to get the exam back. You can learn what you got wrong, and you can take it a second time and get the right answers the second time and actually learn. And then I'll give you the average of the 2 scores to reward the people that have been studying all along. But to be fair, for people that haven't studied as much, they still have a shot to actually learn the material, which is the important part. Point number 14 is you have to have knowledge of the characters in the myth that you've read so far. So the book gives you nice little introductions for all the characters, Minerva and Arachne, King Minos on Crete, that's the son of Europa, and Europa is stolen by Zeus, and you know Latona and Niobe, and you know Apollo and his sister Diana. That's the gist of the myths, but make sure you read all the chapters, the introduction to the myths, and of course you've had to read all the chapters and translate those stories. What I'm testing for by you knowing the names of these characters and who they are is I'm making sure that you have reading comprehension. and that you retain some of the information for this myth. I chose this book specifically because instead of random sentences from Roman authors that no one really knows anymore, I'm giving a text that actually has myths, and most people enjoy stories a little bit more than just random translations taken out of context. So it's a better textbook than most because it actually has continuous prose with stories, and I want you to enjoy those stories and read them and have some retention of them. Thanks. Take the exam after you watch this, and this is me saying bye.